Hello, everybody. How are you doing? Great. Are you looking forward to a nice discussion on security and privacy? Awesome, awesome. My name is Sanjit Dang. I'm an investment director at Intel Capital, and I would love to welcome my two panelists here, the star panelists in the field of security, Michael Reitblat from Forter and Steve Shillingford from Anonyme Labs. Have a seat. I'll give you a quick 1-minute overview of Intel Capital, and then we'll go into 2-minute pitches of each of the panelists. Intel Capital is the venture capital arm of Intel. We exist for a couple of reasons. One is to find new markets for Intel as a company. Second is to drive the software ecosystem for Intel. We invest roughly $400 to $500 million every year in startups globally, but centered around US and Western Europe. We invest in a variety of areas from artificial intelligence to cybersecurity, Internet of Things, big data, you name it. And we tend to lead most of the deals that we do. So I would say 60 to 70% of the deals we do, we are the lead investor. Stage-wise, we are quite stage agnostic, but I would say we are centered around Series A and B. Having said that, we have done a lot of seed stage deals, if we find the team interesting especially, and we have also done late stage deals. A good classic example is Vmware Investment in the pre-IPO round. We look for companies that can bring financial returns to Intel Capital, just like any other VC you would talk to. But in addition to that, we also look for a strategic fit to Intel. And Intel is a pretty horizontal company, sells into all the verticals you can think of, and hence there is always something you can find a fit within Intel. But at the end of the day, we are sitting at the junction of both strategic and financial returns. So I hope this gives you an overview of Intel Capital. And without further ado, why don't we start with Michael?
Thank you. So my name is Michael. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of a company called Forter. And I've been in the, let's call it, bad guy detection business for about 20 years, starting in the Israeli military cyber command and then cybersecurity companies. In the last 12 years in fraud prevention. So through what we're building now, it's kind of the third version of solving the same problem, and I think we're onto something. As you all probably know, if you own any data, someone else owns it by now as well, through every new major breach that happens probably once a month by now. And fraudsters are very, very good at leveraging the data that they steal, automating it, using AI, using any type of new technology you can think of. Most of the time when people talk about fraudsters, they focus on how much money they lose directly, how much money is being stolen from you. What people, and we're in the kind of credit card fraud prevention space, what people don't realize is over $200 billion of online transactions don't happen because retailers are too conservative in managing their risk. For those of you who don't know, if a credit card fraud happens online, unlike in the store, the liability is on the retailer, so they're all kind of managing the risk way too conservatively. I'll switch to this. What we're doing for them is replacing the whole fraud prevention stack. We're just looking at all of their transactions, delivering a real-time yes-no answer. If we said yes and it turns out being fraudulent, that's on us. So the fraud problem moves away from retail to us. We look at all the data aggregately. We can be substantially more accurate. And more importantly, we can balance risk easier because the same customer, we can see them, or the same fraudster, we can see them throughout a variety of retailers. I think when we started the company about 4 years ago, no one believed us from a retail perspective that they will outsource their whole fraud prevention to a startup company. Everyone wanted control. Probably in the last, 3 years ago, there was zero adoption to the way we're running business. What they're doing now is we're at about 10% adoption now, and probably in more so in the biggest retailers, and within 3 years, I expect us to be 80% of the market, at least in the US, and hopefully expanding more internationally.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. Why don't we go to Steve?
Thank you, Sanjit. Steve Shillingford. I'm a reformed data miner. I may have a slide. There we go. I spent my last 10 years doing building surveillance software at my last company, and sort of looked behind the curtain and felt like there was a sort of overreach in the amount of data that was being harvested by companies and by governments. And so I wanted to do something about that. So as the former arms dealer, I decided to create a company with a partner of mine who's now he's the CEO of Symantec. He wasn't at the time, but Greg Clark and I decided to build the company around consumer-oriented apps that allow you to sort of do what you do in the offline world, but in the online world. And that is create different roles, different profiles, different personas, if you will, that you can compartmentalize and organize your digital world. So we call them pseudos or pseudo-identities. And what they allow you to do is to search online, to shop, to sell, to socialize with people that maybe aren't part of your inner circle. And we've been delivering those apps for the last several years. You can find an app called My Pseudo, which is one of our products, in the App Store today. We'll also be launching, as you can see, a partnership with a very large consumer security company to about 100 million users later this year. The whole idea is we want to give people the opportunity to manage their online profile and take control back from the data miners that I was so helpful to. So the company, our center of gravity is in Utah, but as in most companies, we've got other offices, including Australia, and we've got, almost 1.5 million of these pseudo-identities floating around the world. So we're pretty excited, and we hope that we can give some control back to users. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I think both of your companies are touching upon what is very pertinent in the market today. So maybe we'll start off with the elephant in the room, the Facebook data issue. Would love to get your thoughts on that issue and who is actually at fault. Is it Facebook or is it the users? Michael, we'll start with you.
Well, I may have a different perspective than most, because I think as a user, when you give control of your data to anyone else, you should assume that it gets everywhere, whether it's directly through the companies selling your data to someone else, or companies just not being responsible with your data and it's getting lost, or governments, whether it's your government or someone else's government, getting a peek at this data because of how they operate. So at least my personal assumption is all of my data, everything I know about myself and everything I don't know about myself, someone else already looks at.
Steve?
Look, I think we shouldn't be surprised that a company that said they needed to know everything about you monetized that, and that another company took that information and manipulated it. I think, that was bound to happen. I think the real question should be, we have someone in personified sort of data harvesting, Mr. Zuckerberg, who is very, successful at distributing sort of cocaine on the internet.
Cocaine, I love the terminology here. Is Zuckerberg listening?
And
recording here.
I mean, he's the Pablo Escobar of the online digital world.
Absolutely.
So why are we surprised that A, someone stole his stash and used it to their benefit, and B, that people would OD on it? That's like, we should understand that and accept that. So in terms of blame, I think the blame goes to Michael's point. I think, we should realize we're part of the problem, but I think we also as an industry need to give people some tools to sort of wean themselves off the drug.
Exactly. That brings me to the point, maybe users knew they were giving this data and it will go, et cetera, or maybe they didn't, but moving beyond to the point, do users really care about data loss unless they lose money? Steve?
Look, I think we live in a 140-character world, And so if you're going to put a 5,000-word terms of service in front of somebody between them and access to a cat meme, then we can't expect people to realize what they're doing. And so there's this notion of informed consent. And actually, the Europeans are much further ahead than we are in this notion, where we need to simplify, take the lawyering out, and say, here's what I'm going to do with the data. Do you accept? And if it's that transparent, and that's really the key word here, if it's that transparent, I think people should be put in a position to decide for themselves how much or how little they want to share. And I think if we do that, that would be a really good step in the right direction.
Michael?
So I think, different people have different preferences. And I don't think we can lawyer everyone under the same rule. I mean, you mentioned European law, so GDPR. From my perspective, there has a lot of really good impact. But GDPR is a European law that from their side applies to US companies. And from the US side, it doesn't apply to them. And it's impossible for companies to understand which laws, since the internet is global and you're addressing consumers from all over the world, which laws they have to kind of abide by. Some of them are contradicting, right? Europeans say, store European citizens' data in Europe and don't have anyone access to. The Russians say, store Russian citizens' data in Russia and give Russian government access to. Otherwise, you're not allowed to operate it. So what do you do?
Yeah, you get caught. Absolutely, absolutely. So, security breaches are not new. Yes, this Facebook issue is new, but
Facebook wasn't a breach.
I agree. But in general, if we generalize this and say, look at the security breaches, they've been going on forever. Why do you think now is the right time for solution like what you guys are building, either at what you are building, Michael, or what you are building, Steve, at Anonyme Labs, to get adopted in the market now?
Well, I would say twofold. I think, one, no company and no government is going to solve this problem. I think, legislation, if anybody saw the hearings with Zuckerberg, it was like explaining Facebook to your grandparents. It's just not going to happen, right? And companies are going to be, generally speaking, profit-driven. Facebook is doing exactly what it's designed to do, which is make money. What we have to do is we have to give people, whether they're in Europe, Russia, the United States, the ability to make choices about how they allocate their time. If we spent more time thinking about how we disseminate our information and maybe less time looking at the ingredients on the back of something we bought at Whole Foods, we might be in better shape, right? But no law is going to solve this problem, as Michael's pointed out. I think it's really about we need to make the data that hackers and, Cambridge Analytics and others go after, we need to make that data sort of expired so that when they go after that data, it's not as useful and it's not, perpetually stored and permanent so that it can be used for years at a time.
I also think it's a matter of scale, right? Breaches happened 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but no one really cared because the impact was 10,000 people, right? It's not main news. And in our industry, so I think late 2013, Target got breached. And 40 million credit cards got stolen. And this was probably a couple months away from a Home Depot breach and a TJ Maxx breach. And this is where Congress and a lot of other people said, holy shit, we need to take care of this. And really quickly, the industry said, let's not store credit cards and tokenize everything, shifting the problem somewhere else. I think now Equifax got breached. And now every adult American has all of their details somewhere, and people are addressing that. To your previous question about laws are always, or lawmakers, are always looking backwards saying, oh, this doesn't work now. We should have probably fixed it 10 years ago, but there were other issues they were dealing with, and it's not as visible. So they're trying to address it now, and by the time there'll be a new problem because the world will change rapidly.
I would say there's a notion that's going around in both the enterprise and the consumer space around something called strong anonymity, which is this notion of I can guarantee that Michael, whether it's really Michael or not, is going to be a reliable source for a transaction, and he and I can engage in some commerce without having to know everything about Michael. I don't need to know his birth date or his social or his address. I just know that Michael's a reliable source. And that notion needs to be propagated across both of those landscapes, whether it's the enterprise or the consumer space, so that people cannot have to feel like they have to give all of their legal identity out to Uber, Airbnb, and BoatsRUs.com, right? They can be selective. Maybe their inner circle gets their mobile number, but maybe everybody else gets something else. But the point is, consumers and individuals need to choose.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And like Michael, you said as well, we are always in reactive mode for some of these things. The question is, how do we be more proactive? And along those lines, do you think blockchain can help solve some of these problems?
So I haven't seen any architecture of blockchain that works at scale, by definition. Maybe I'm not an expert, but most of them, the bigger the system is, the worse it works from a kind of response perspective, right? It takes longer. Unlike the internet, which is the bigger it is, the better it works. Most blockchain architecture, at least the one I've looked at, but as I said, I'm not an expert, just can't scale well enough. For small problems or small scale problems, it can solve a lot of issues.
Yeah.
I'm a huge blockchain fan. I think it's the third wave of computing. I'm not an expert, but God knows I've read a lot about it, and we're doing some work at Anonyome on it. I'll tell you what I think is important about blockchain is, one, it's a decentralizer. And in a world where we had sort of the 2007 banking crisis where the world almost came to an end and not one banker went to jail, and governments have done some crazy things in response, I think people, whether you believe in Bitcoin or not, are trying to take control of their destiny, and they believe in the decentralizing impact of blockchain. And so I can't remember who said this, but there's always that quote of you sort of underestimate the near-term impacts of a technology, or no, overestimate the near term and underestimate the long term. I think blockchain's the same way. I think the technical aspects, the scale, these are all first order problems that'll get solved. I think in the long run, it will change the way big companies, big governments are able to sort of perform middleman-like tasks in the world.
Awesome to hear you're a big blockchain believer and a fan. In the last few seconds, just want you to give me a quick 2 or 3 word answer on this. Where will security be 5 years from now? Michael?
I think in really, really shortly, every company should have security as the #1 problem they address today, because otherwise they won't be ready. There are so many different threats we are not thinking about now, that computing power enables companies to do. Right? I can reconstruct, or I can't, but other companies will be able to reconstruct kind of build a new you from your DNA with your voice sampling, with everything you know. How do you control that? Right? It's not possible today, but we're going there.
Right. Steve?
I think for the companies, security is the industry that keeps on giving. But I think just like everything else in the enterprise space, consumers are going to drive the change. And so you'll see the consumerization. Consumers will make decisions about how they secure themselves and keep themselves safe online, and that's going to make its way into the enterprise.
Awesome, awesome. On that note, we'd like to thank both Michael and Steve for expert comments on security, and I hope all of you found it useful. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.